June 5th, 1944. Over Normandy. 2300 hours. June 5th, 1944. Somewhere over the English Channel, the C-47 Dakota. That's all, brother groaned under the weight of men and steel. Inside red light bathed 20 paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division, their faces streaked with black grease paint eyes, hollow and unblinking. The air reeked of sweat, canvas, and fear. Engines thundered just outside the fuselage, two Pratt & Whitney R-1830 twin Wasps pounding like war drums as the aircraft climbed through heavy cloud. Private Jack Red Bishop, 21 years old, knelt beside the open door. His gloved hands clenched the static line like a rosary. The jumpmaster, Lieutenant George Buck Carter, leaned toward him, shouting over the roar, 5 minutes, until they dropped into history. Bishop could barely hear. The roar of 800 planes filled the sky, an armada of C-47s, C-53s, and converted gliders stretching from horizon to horizon. Far below the channel was a dark void, dotted with the faint silhouettes of landing craft and destroyers moving toward the French coast. The night air stung his cheeks. He glanced at the man across from him, Sergeant Will Parnell, the squad's radio man, lips moving in a silent prayer. Someone behind them vomited into a paper bag. No one laughed. Outside, tracer fire began to climb through the clouds. Bright orange streams from German Flak-Vierling 20mm cannons arced upward, tearing through the mist. The first bursts rocked the plane. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, tight and urgent. "Taking flak! Hold on, boys!" The aircraft jolted. A round ripped through the fuselage, leaving a ragged hole inches above Bishop's head. Cold air knifed in. The red light flickered, steadied. Lieutenant Carter checked his watch. 10 hours. "Get ready," he shouted, pointing to the open door. "Remember your drop zone." DZ. Easy red. Once you're out, find your bearings, rally at Le Grand Chemin crossroads. The paratroopers nodded, mechanical rehearsed 100 times back in England. But everyone knew the reality. The night sky was chaos. Winds were high visibility, near zero, and the German flak network was awake. Scattered drops were inevitable. Carter slapped the light panel. Red shifted to green. "Go, go, go!" Bishop leapt into the void. Instant cold. The roar vanished, replaced by wind screaming in his ears. The blackness of Normandy yawned below, endless and featureless. For a heartbeat, he felt weightless. Then the parachute jerked open with a violent snap. The straps bit into his shoulders. He swung beneath the canopy, breath shallow, pulse hammering. He looked around. Parachutes dotted the sky like pale ghosts, but far fewer than there should have been. The formation had scattered. Tracer fire slashed through the darkness, some bursts so close he could feel the heat. To the west, a C-47 spiraled down in flames, its cargo of men still aboard. The explosion rolled across the fields like thunder. Below the countryside emerged hedgerows, winding lanes, tiny farmhouses flickering with muzzle flashes. The Germans were awake. Bishop hit the ground hard in a pasture, tumbling into wet grass. His leg twisted but held. He ripped off the chute, pulled his M1A1 carbine from its case, and crouched low. All around him came the scattered calls of paratroopers, challenge words whispered in the dark flash. "Thunder," he whispered back. "Thunder." 3 figures emerged from the hedgerow, 2 from his own unit, 1 from the 506th PIR. "We're off target," one hissed. "No idea where the hell we are." Bishop checked his compass. It spun uselessly, the needle stuck. "Radio dead," said Parnell, slapping the SCR-300 on his back. "Took shrapnel." They were alone, one squad lost in enemy country. The plan called for over 13,000 paratroopers to drop across Normandy, securing bridges, crossroads, and causeways hours before the seaborne invasion. But the drop zones were chaos, thick fog, anti-aircraft fire, navigational errors. Men were landing miles from their objectives. Still scattered or not, Their mission was clear: sow confusion, cut communications, and hold key routes until dawn. Bishop motioned to move. They crept through the hedgerows, boots silent on damp soil. Distant gunfire echoed staccato bursts of MP40s, the heavier thump of MG42s. Somewhere to the east, an ammunition dump went up in flames, turning the low clouds orange. They crossed a narrow road lined with poplars. A signpost read, Sainte-Mère-Église, 3 kilomètres. That name burned into every paratrooper's briefing, the first town to be liberated in France. Then headlights. A German Kubelwagen rattled down the road, 2 soldiers inside rifles slung. The Americans dove into the ditch, mud splashing. Bishop raised his carbine finger, trembling on the trigger. The engine droned closer, closer, then passed. The men exhaled. Parnell grinned faintly. Guess we're in France. They moved again through orchards, heavy with dew, toward the distant sound of battle. By now, the night sky was alive with parachutes and flares. German defenders fired wildly into the air, convinced an entire army was descending on them. In the village of Sainte-Mère-Église itself, paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne's 505th Regiment were already fighting street to street. A house had caught fire from a stray flare, lighting the square like day. Dozens of paratroopers had been shot mid-air by startled German troops. One man, Private John Steele, dangled helplessly from the church steeple, his parachute caught on the spire, watching his comrades die below. By Zora 1:30, German command posts from Cherbourg to Carentan were in disarray. Field telephones rang unanswered. Reports flooded in of enemy landings everywhere, though none could determine where the main assault was. Officers shouted contradictory orders. Some thought the airborne drops were decoys, others believed the invasion was already underway. In Ravenneauville, a stunned German major stood in his doorway, staring at the night sky ablaze with flares and burning planes. Fallschirmjäger, he muttered, paratroopers. His aide replied, 9, Herr Major. Amerikaner. Across the hedgerows, Bishop's small band pushed on, guided by the sound of battle. They reached a farmhouse where 2 paratroopers were pinned by machine gun fire. Bullets tore through the walls, splintering wood. Without hesitation, Bishop crawled to the flank, lobbed a grenade through a window. The blast silenced the gun. Inside, smoke and dust choked the air, and the smell of cordite, sharp and metallic, filled their lungs. When the echo faded, Parnell looked at Bishop. "We're off the map," he said. Bishop nodded. "Then we'll make our own." As the first faint streaks of dawn touched the horizon, the fields of Normandy were scattered with small groups like theirs, disoriented under strength, but burning with purpose. For the Germans, it was only the beginning. 00:30 hours, June 6, 1944. The blackness above the Cotentin Peninsula was alive with motion wings, engines, tracer arcs, and falling men. What had begun as a meticulously plotted operation on maps in southern England had erupted into a storm of confusion spread across 40 miles of French countryside. The first wave of C-47 Dakotas had crossed the coast near Utah Beach, each bearing a stick of paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. They had flown low to avoid radar, just 500 to 1,000 feet above ground, in total radio silence. But the reality of combat was chaos. Thick ground fog, broken cloud, and the relentless strobe of German flak batteries, turning the night into a hellish light show. Pilot Captain Ed Porter, flying one of the lead planes of the 82nd's 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, fought the yoke with both hands as turbulence buffeted his aircraft. "Hold steady," his co-pilot shouted. The altimeter needle jumped wildly. Below, tracer streams stitched the darkness. The flak bursts came closer, dull red spheres expanding into black puffs that rocked the plane with concussive thuds. Flak at 3 o'clock, heavy. The right wing shuddered. Metal screamed. The pilot smelled burning insulation. In the rear, paratroopers clung to the overhead cables as the plane lurched. Someone was praying aloud. "Get them out," Porter yelled. The green light blinked. The jumpmaster kicked open the door, shouting into the roaring slipstream, "Go, go, go!" The men disappeared one by one into the black. The moment they jumped, the plane took another hit. Porter fought to keep it level long enough to limp back toward the Channel engine's coughing flame. Below, the paratroopers tumbled through thick cloud, blind and alone. One landed in the flooded Marais de Carentan, his chute dragging him under icy water. Another hit the roof of a barn and broke his leg. A third came down in an orchard, his canopy caught in apple trees, hanging helplessly as German voices approached on the road below. In the space of 20 minutes, the Allied airborne assault had devolved into hundreds of micro-battles fought by scattered, terrified men, but men trained for exactly this kind of chaos. Hours earlier, before the main drop, small teams of elite pathfinders had jumped behind enemy lines to set up radio beacons and Eureka-Rebecca radar homing systems that would guide the transport planes to their drop zones. Many never succeeded. At Drop Zone O near Sainte-Mère-Église, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Lillyman and his team landed under heavy fire at 0020 hours. The Germans were already alert, spooked by the distant drone of engines overhead. The pathfinders scrambled to assemble their beacon, hammering the antenna into the earth. A flare arced up, blue, then red, then white, the coded pattern signaling drop zone secured. Lillyman keyed his hand mic Fox to all transports, DZO active. Bring them in. But many aircraft were miles off course. Some pilots mistook the fires from burning farms for flares. Others, disoriented by wind and smoke, released their sticks far from target. Instead of organized battalions landing in tight formation, clusters of 5 or 10 men found themselves scattered across a vast landscape of hedgerows, rivers, and villages. The Germans, too, were bewildered. Reports flooded into division headquarters at Saint-Lô and Carentan. Enemy parachutists sighted near Cherbourg, near Bayeux, near Caen, everywhere at once. Some officers dismissed them as small raiding parties. Others believed a full-scale invasion had begun inland. At Saint-Lô, General Friedrich Dollmann, commanding the German 7th Army, was woken by frantic telephone calls. Impossible, he said, lighting a cigarette with trembling fingers. They wouldn't jump at night. But within minutes, the sound of gunfire and the glow of fires outside proved otherwise. Northwest of Sainte-Mère-Église, elements of the 82nd Airborne Division's 505th landed with relative success near their intended zone. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Vandervoort, despite a broken ankle from the jump, rallied his men. Limping with a makeshift cane, he directed them to secure the crossroads south of town, the lifeline connecting the beaches to the interior. Dig in here, he ordered. The Krauts will counterattack at dawn. Around him, paratroopers scurried to set up defensive positions among hedgerows and stone walls. The smell of wet earth mixed with cordite and crushed grass. The clatter of rifles being loaded echoed through the dark. Vandervoort's radio operator finally made contact with another unit. 70 men accounted for, sir. Maybe 100 in the area, others still scattered. That's enough, Vandervoort replied. We'll hold with what we've got. By 0200 hours, Sainte-Mère-Église was under full assault. Flares lit the sky as paratroopers fought from house to house, clearing the town square. Civilians huddled in basements, clutching rosaries. The church steeple loomed over the chaos, its bell clanging madly as fires spread through the rooftops. The Germans counterattacked with infantry from the 91st Luftland Division, but disorganization crippled them. Communications were down, and many officers believed they were facing thousands, not hundreds. By dawn, Vandervoort's men controlled the town, the first liberated in France. To the south, the 101st Airborne faced its own nightmare. Paratroopers of the 502nd and 506th PIR landed amid flooded fields near Carentan. The Germans had deliberately opened dikes to turn the lowlands into a defensive swamp. Many men drowned under the weight of their equipment. Those who survived clawed through the mud toward dry ground. Their weapons soaked, their radios useless. One group under Lieutenant Richard Winters regrouped near the hamlet of Le Grand Chemin. We're scattered, but so are they, Winters told his men. We hit them fast and make them think we're everywhere. They did just that, ambushing German patrols, blowing bridges, cutting phone lines. Within hours, confusion rippled through the German rear. Local civilians emerged from hiding, pointing directions in broken English. "Bosch is there," one whispered, gesturing toward a farmhouse. Winters nodded and led his men in silence. They attacked just before dawn, grenades and M1 rifles tearing through the thin walls. When it was over, 8 Germans lay dead, and a map showing nearby artillery positions was in American hands. Winters spread it out under a flickering flashlight. "These guns are aimed at Utah Beach," he realized. "If we don't take them out, those boys won't make it ashore." The mission that would become legend, the assault on Brecourt Manor, was about to begin. At Carentan, Colonel Friedrich von der Heide, commander of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, received his first coherent reports around 0300. "Enemy paratroopers everywhere," his adjutant said breathlessly. "We can't tell their strength." Von der Heide himself, a veteran of Crete, knew paratroopers well. "Then they are scattered," he replied coolly. "Now is the time to crush them before they form up." He grabbed his field coat and binoculars. "Alert all units. I will lead the counterattack myself." But by then, the Americans were already cutting roads, blowing bridges, and seizing key intersections. Every minute of confusion bought precious time for the invasion fleet steaming toward the beaches. By the time von der Heide's men began moving, dawn was breaking over Normandy, and the sky to the north was filling with the silhouettes of ships and aircraft beyond counting. The invasion of Europe had begun, and the first blows had already been struck by men who had fallen from the midnight sky. 400 hours, June 6, 1944. The gray light of dawn crept slowly over Normandy, revealing a landscape scarred by chaos. Smoke rose from hedgerows, barns burned along country roads, and the cries of wounded men, German and American alike, echoed through the mist. The invasion had already begun in the dark, long before the first landing craft touched the beaches. For the men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, the battlefield was a patchwork of confusion. The plan on paper had been clean. Pathfinders would mark drop zones with Eureka beacons and colored Aldis lamps. The transport squadrons would arrive in tight formations, and paratroopers would land within a mile of their objectives. Reality tore that plan to pieces. Wind shear flak and navigational errors scattered units across 60 miles. Platoons dropped into marshes, onto rooftops, and into German strongpoints. Entire sticks vanished in the dark, but where organization failed, instinct took over. Southwest of Sainte-Mère-Église, a small group of 12 paratroopers from E Company 506th PIR stumbled through waist-high hedges. Their lieutenant, Richard Winters, studied his map by flashlight, the edges damp from dew. "Le Grand Chemin should be half a kilometer that way," he said quietly. "But none of these roads line up." Corporal Joe Toy muttered, "Maybe the Krauts moved the roads." They heard it then, the metallic clank of an MG-42 being loaded. Winters raised his hand, signaling halt. They hit the dirt as tracer fire sliced across the hedgerow. "Flank left," Winters hissed. Toye and another man crawled through the ditch, grenades ready. On Winters' signal, they rose together. 2 grenades arced over the hedge. The explosion ripped through the still air, followed by screams. Winters leapt over, firing his M1. 3 Germans lay sprawled in the mud, their helmets rolling away. "Check for intel," he ordered. Toye bent down and pulled a folded map from a corpse's pocket. It was detailed, showing German artillery positions south of Brecourt Manor. 4 105mm howitzers dug into tree lines pointed directly toward Utah Beach. Winters stared at it, realization dawning. "They're shelling the beachhead," he said. "We take them out, or the whole landing's in jeopardy." At 8:30 hours, Winters gathered what men he could find, 13 in all. They moved under cover of hedgerows toward the distant thump of artillery. Ahead, across open fields, they saw it 4 guns in a row, each protected by trenches and machine guns. Winters studied the terrain. "We'll go in from the right flank. 2 teams, one suppressing, one assaulting. Move fast, use the trenches." It was an audacious plan, attacking a battery manned by 60 Germans with barely a dozen paratroopers. The first grenade exploded in the nearest gun pit. Then came the shouts, the blur of motion. Winters sprinted across the field, carbine raised. His men followed, firing in short, controlled bursts. Machine gun fire whined past. A paratrooper dropped beside him, clutching his leg. Winters didn't stop. They stormed the first trench, clearing it with grenades and bayonets. The gun crew fell where they stood. Winters' voice cut through the chaos. Set TNT, moved to the next. One by one, the guns were destroyed. German counterfire grew desperate, erratic. By 10:30, it was over. The howitzers lay silent, their barrels twisted and smoking. Toya slumped against a tree, breathing hard. "We're supposed to be lost," he said. Winters looked toward the horizon. "Then let's stay lost," he replied. While Winters' small unit fought its private war to the north, Lieutenant Colonel Vandervoort's 505th held the key junction south of Sainte-Mère-Église. The Germans struck at dawn with armored cars and infantry from the 91st Luftland Division. "Here they come," someone shouted. Panzer Grenadiers emerged from the mist, firing MP-40s and lobbing grenades. The paratroopers returned fire with rifles, bazookas, and captured MG-42s. Vandervoort, hobbling on his broken ankle, crawled between foxholes, shouting encouragement. "Hold that road, no one gets through." The fight raged for hours. At 0700, the first M5 tank from the beaches arrived, an American light tank from the 4th Division, its guns spitting fire. The enemy faltered, then withdrew. By mid-morning, Sainte-Mère-Église was firmly in Allied hands, the first French town liberated. Vandervoort sat on a broken wall, lighting a cigarette with trembling fingers. "Tell them," he said to his aide, "the road to Utah is open." Not all went so well. Many paratroopers never made it out of their drop zones. Near Amfreville, Private Harold Day of the 501st landed in a tree, tangled in his lines. Below him, German soldiers shouted and searched the field with flashlights. Day hung there for hours, praying they wouldn't look up. Farther west, groups of paratroopers dropped into flooded marshes and drowned under the weight of 80-pound packs. Radios failed, beacons were destroyed, and command cohesion evaporated. Some officers never found a single man from their company until 2 days later. Yet even in isolation they fought. Small bands ambushed convoys, seized bridges, and blew rail lines. By dawn, German rear areas were riddled with skirmishes that made every road dangerous. Confusion reigned from Cherbourg to Caen. A captured German lieutenant later confessed, "We thought thousands had landed." Every hedgerow had an enemy. At 0500, General Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, commander of the 709th Infantry Division, telephoned 7th Army HQ in St. Lo. "Enemy parachute troops in strength," he reported. "Bridges cut, communication disrupted. Request permission to engage with reserves." But there were no reserves to send. German command was paralyzed by uncertainty. Reports of landings along the entire Norman coast made it impossible to pinpoint the true invasion site. By the time Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B, learned of the drops, it was already too late. He was in Germany, attending his wife's birthday. His staff hesitated to wake him. The delay would prove fatal to the German defense. At 0600, the first light of full day touched the coast. Bishop, the young paratrooper from earlier, stood with his ragged squad atop a hedgerow watching the horizon. Through the haze, he could see it, hundreds of ships stretching to the edge of the world. The sea itself seemed alive. Parnell whistled softly. "God help the poor bastards down there." Bishop checked his carbine. "They won't need help," he said quietly. "We already gave it to them." Behind them, the thunder of distant naval guns rolled across the countryside, the beginning of D-Day's seaborne assault. But for the men who had dropped from the midnight sky, the battle was far from over. 6:30 hours, June 6, 1944. The sun was up over Normandy, now filtered through a low ceiling of smoke and drifting mist. From the hedgerows, the paratroopers could see the invasion fleet in the distance, an armada of gray silhouettes belching fire and thunder. The sea seemed alive with motion, landing craft infantry LCIs, Higgins boats, and destroyers firing their 5-inch guns into the coast. The airborne men, scattered and bloodied from the night's chaos, watched in grim silence. They had done their job, though many didn't yet realize how completely. The roads to Utah and Omaha were cut. German communication lines, severed artillery batteries, silenced, and bridges blown. Yet now they faced the cruelest phase of all to hold what they had taken, isolated, outnumbered, and far from resupply. In the pale light, the church square at Sainte-Mère-Église was a ruin. The fires from the night's fighting still smoldered. Charred shutters hung from windows, and spent shell casings littered the cobblestones. On the steeple, Private John Steele's parachute still flapped lazily. His body hung limp, but he was alive, unconscious, feigning death, while German soldiers below moved past. Inside the town, Colonel Roy Lindquist of the 508th PIR organized defenses. "We've got to hold this junction," he barked. His men dug in behind stone walls and garden hedges, covering the roads from Chef Dupont and Neuville-aux-Plaines. French civilians emerged cautiously from cellars, clutching children, eyes wide with disbelief. Some approached offering water or wine. One old man pointed toward the burning steeple and murmured, "Les Américains." Enfin. Finally. At Oro 800, the first German counterattack hit from the North Infantry, supported by light armored cars. The paratroopers met them with bazookas and captured MG-42s. Bullets sparked off stone walls, grenades burst among the gravestones in the churchyard. Sergeant Bill Guarneri of the 506th fired until his barrel smoked. "Don't let 'em take that road," he yelled. After 2 hours, the attack broke off. The Germans withdrew, leaving their dead in the fields. Sainte-Mère-Église was secure. Lindquist exhaled slowly. "Send word to the beaches," he said. "Tell them the way inland is open." To the southwest, another drama unfolded on the flooded plains behind Utah Beach. The Germans had opened the sea locks days earlier. The only routes inland were narrow causeways raised above the floodwater and flanked by open ground. At La Barquette Lock, a mixed group of paratroopers from the 501st and 506th stumbled upon one of these vital crossings. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole, commander of the 3rd Battalion, took one look at the position and ordered, "Take it before they know we're here." They crept forward, moving through knee-deep water, until a German sentry spotted movement and fired. The swamp erupted in gunfire. Cole's men charged, splashing through the marsh under tracers. They reached the lock, throwing grenades into the machine gun nests. By mid-morning, the lock was in American hands. Cole signaled his radio man, "This is lightning." La Barquette secured, holding until relieved. At Brécourt Manor Winters, and his 13 men sat among the shattered gun pits, the smoke from their victory still hanging heavy. The 100 Huns they had destroyed had fired their last shells toward Utah. In less than 2 hours, those guns might have killed thousands on the beaches. Winters checked his watch. "They should be hitting the coast about now," he said. The distant rumble of naval guns answered. They gathered weapons and canteens from the fallen. No one spoke of the men they'd lost. There was no time for that. By 0900, Winters led them east toward the sound of heavier fighting. The Battle of Normandy was moving fast. In Carentan, Colonel von der Heide of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment assembled his paratroopers for a counterattack. His men, hardened veterans of Crete and Italy, were among the best in the Wehrmacht. "They fight like wolves," he said. By mid-morning, his men were moving through the bocage, using the dense hedgerows for cover. Their FG-42 rifles cracked from hidden positions. At 10:30, von der Heide's lead companies struck near Gregnes, hitting paratroopers from the 507th. The fight was savage, hand-to-hand in orchards and barns. The Americans, outnumbered 3-1, refused to yield. Von der Heide's aide muttered, "These men fight like demons." By noon, reports from across the front reached German headquarters in St. Lo. Allied forces had landed in strength at 5 beaches. General Dolman stared at the map. "Where are our reserves, Panzer Lehr still assembling?" came the reply. the 12th SS moving from Caen. Dolman slammed his fist on the table. Then we are blind and paralyzed. Outside, the sky buzzed with Allied fighters. In a farmhouse near Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, Bishop's squad watched the sky fill with new aircraft, bombers, gliders, and engines heading inland. Parnell grinned through cracked lips. "They're coming to finish it." Bishop nodded. "And we're still here." They dug in along a hedgerow, rifles ready. The rumble of engines grew louder, American Shermans moving inland. One of the tank commanders waved as they passed. "See you in Paris, boys," he shouted. The paratroopers laughed, half in disbelief. But for the first time in 2 days, the sound of those engines meant relief and victory. The first Allied tanks rolled through Sainte-Mère-Église just before noon. Civilians cheered, waving flags they had hidden since 1940. Paratroopers sat slumped on the sidewalks, faces blackened with soot and fatigue, their helmets dented, uniforms torn. One French boy handed Sergeant Guarnere an apple. "Pour la liberté," he said. "For freedom." Guarnere smiled weakly. "Yeah," he said. "For freedom." The men had dropped into hell in the darkness and fought all night. Now, under the noonday sun, they stood on liberated soil. They had fallen from the midnight sky and broken the spine of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. 1400 hours, June 6, 1944. The air over Normandy shimmered with heat and cordite. The thunder of naval guns from the Channel rolled across the countryside like an endless storm. On the beaches, tens of thousands of soldiers poured ashore. Inland, the paratroopers clung to their scattered strongholds. Private Jack Bishop crouched in a drainage ditch near a crossroads outside Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. His carbine rested across his knees. Around him, his squad, what was left of it, watched the hedgerows for movement. Sergeant Parnell was cleaning his weapon beside him. "You know they said the war'd be over by Christmas. Didn't say which one." Bishop gave a tired grin. "Long as it's ours." From down the lane came the distant rattle of engines, German heavy. Contact. South Road. Through the hedgerow gaps they saw a German Sainte-Mère-Église 250 half-track followed by infantry in field gray uniforms. Bishop whispered, "Hold fire. Wait till they're in the kill zone." At 50 yards, Bishop's hand went down. Now, the Panzerfaust roared, slamming into the lead half-track. It erupted in flame. The Americans opened up M1's Thompsons and captured MG-42s. A grenade rolled into the ditch beside Bishop. He kicked it away and ducked as it exploded, showering him with dirt. "They're flanking left," he yelled. Toye answered with a burst from his Thompson. Not today. After 10 brutal minutes, the survivors of the German patrol broke and ran. The road was littered with bodies and burning vehicles. Parnell slumped against a tree. "You think they'll send more?" Bishop nodded. "Count on it." At the same hour, miles to the south, German commanders struggled to piece together what was happening. At Saint-Lô, General Dolman's headquarters was chaos. "The situation is fluid," an officer said. "Fluid. It's a flood." "Where is the 21st Panzer Division?" "Still near Caen, awaiting orders." "Then give them orders." But the orders bogged down in Hitler's rigid chain of command. The Führer still believed the main invasion would come at Pas de Calais. Until he was certain, the armored reserves were forbidden to move. Meanwhile, Normandy's local commanders fought blind. In the hedgerows near Carentan, Lieutenant Richard Winters led his men carefully along a sunken lane. A French farmer pointed toward a farmhouse. "Allemands. Beaucoup." Winters nodded. "We hit them fast and loud." The first shot cracked. Grenades burst through windows. 5 minutes later, 10 Germans were dead, 3 captured. "They didn't even know the beaches fell," Toye said. "Then we'll keep it that way," Winters replied. He looked down the lane. "Keep moving. Don't wait for orders. We make our own front." At La Fière Bridge, paratroopers of the 82nd fought one of the fiercest engagements of D-Day. At 1500 hours, German tanks and infantry counterattacked from the west. Mortars fell in sheets, churning the mud and water. Lieutenant John Red Dog Dolan fired his bazooka from a crater, destroying a Panzer IV. "Reload," he screamed. The Germans surged again. Paratroopers from the 507th fell by the dozen. Captain Raff shouted, "Hold this damn bridge!" By sunset, the bridge was still in American hands, but at a terrible cost. The Mer de Ray ran red beneath it. In a shattered farmhouse near Pont-l'Abbé, Oberstleutnant Helmut Richter demanded, "Who are these paratroopers? They strike, then vanish." "Small units everywhere," his adjutant said. "They came out of the sky," Richter muttered. By nightfall, the phrase spread, "Geister aus dem Himmel," ghosts from the sky. As the sun sank toward the hedgerows, the first reinforcements from the beaches reached the airborne lines. A sergeant from the 4th Division stopped beside Bishop. "You the boys that dropped last night?" "Yeah," Bishop said. "You hold this with just small arms, mostly luck. You earned your pay." As the last light faded, the paratroopers finally allowed themselves to exhale. The fields were quiet now. The path from the beaches to the interior was open. They had held scattered, battered, but unbroken. But in the darkness beyond the hedgerows, the 6th Fallschirmjäger and 91st Division were regrouping. Night would bring no rest. 2100 hours, June 6, 1944. The light drained from the sky, and with it went the illusion of safety. Across the Norman countryside, the air thickened with the smell of cordite, churned soil, and death. The Allied beachheads were secure enough for the moment, but inland, the airborne divisions were still fighting for every hedgerow, crossroads, and bridge. They had stopped the enemy's counterattacks during the day, but now came the long, uncertain night. Private Jack Bishop sat with his back to a tree, cleaning his carbine by touch in the last light. The fields around Sainte-Marie-du-Mont were quiet, except for the distant groan of artillery and the croak of frogs from flooded ditches. His hands trembled from exhaustion. They hadn't slept in nearly 40 hours. Parnell, their sergeant, knelt nearby, checking the radio. A captured German set. "Still nothing," he muttered. "Can't raise anyone from regimental. Static on all channels." "Maybe they think we're dead," Bishop said. Parnell grinned faintly. "Maybe we are." A soft rustle came from the hedgerow. Every man froze, weapons snapping up. A voice whispered, "Flash." Bishop exhaled. Thunder. 3 shapes emerged from the dark. Paratroopers mud-caked and hollow-eyed. One carried a Thompson, another limped his boot wrapped in bloody bandages. The third, a corporal with a cut across his cheek, whispered, "E Company 501st. You boys holding this line?" "Line," Parnell scoffed. "Haven't seen a line since England." The corporal nodded grimly. "Then we make one." The darkness of the bocage. The Normandy bocage, the maze of earthen hedgerows that divided the farmland, was both shield and trap. In daylight it gave cover. At night, it was a labyrinth. Units wandered aimlessly, stumbling into each other or into enemy patrols at 10 paces. In one sector near Carentan, Lieutenant Richard Winters led what remained of his platoon along a sunken road. The air was heavy with mist and gun smoke. Every step crunched on gravel and broken glass. Quiet, Winters whispered. "They're close." Ahead, a German patrol passed across the road. 6 men, their helmets faintly gleaming. Winters raised his hand. "Hold." The Germans stopped, suddenly sensing something. Then one turned his head. Too late. Winters fired first. His carbine cracked in the silence. The patrol dropped in seconds, their bodies tumbling into the ditch. The smell of blood filled the narrow lane. Toye leaned close. "Think that's all of them?" Winters listened. Somewhere to the east, faint shouting, and the grind of engines echoed. "No," he said quietly. "That's just the beginning. They come in waves." By midnight, the Germans struck again, probing attacks across the entire front. Infantry from the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment and remnants of the 91st Luftlande Division pressed the American perimeter in small groups, guided by flares and shouted commands. At La Fière Bridge, paratroopers who had fought all day now battled by the light of burning vehicles. Mortars exploded among them, spraying mud and shrapnel. Men who had no helmets left wrapped towels around their heads. Machine gun barrels glowed red from continuous fire. Lieutenant John Dolan, his voice hoarse, shouted over the din. "Hold the bridge. Nobody crosses." A German MG-42 opened up from across the river. The stream of bullets tore through the parapet, killing 2 men instantly. Dolan grabbed a bar and fired until the gun clicked empty. His loader, a teenager from Ohio, handed him a fresh magazine with shaking hands. "They come in waves," Dolan gasped. "And we're the damn shore." At dawn, the attacks ceased as suddenly as they'd begun. The riverbank was littered with bodies. Smoke rose from burning wrecks drifting across the fields. The bridge still stood, fighting blind. Behind the lines, chaos ruled both sides. German units fought with outdated maps and broken radios. Orders contradicted themselves. One colonel at Montebourg received 3 separate commands before sunrise. Advance to Sainte-Mère-Église. Hold your current position and retreat to Valognes. He obeyed none, for the Americans' coordination was equally fragile. Communications between airborne and beach forces remained patchy. Many units fought without knowing who was on their flanks. Entire battalions operated as independent guerrilla groups. General Maxwell Taylor, commander of the 101st, described it best in his field diary. "No line, no orders, only survival and movement. But movement itself is victory." Taylor moved on foot with a handful of bodyguards, stopping at crossroads to redirect isolated squads. "The Beach Boys are coming inland," he told one group of exhausted troopers. "Hold till they get here." They saluted wearily and disappeared back into the hedgerows. The night belongs to the dead. For Bishop and his squad, the second night was a blur of fear and fatigue. They took turns on watch, staring into the darkness for any sign of movement. Fireflies blinked in the fields like tracer rounds. Occasionally gunfire flickered far away, echoing faintly across the marshes. Sometime after 200, a German voice called out from the road, 2 words slurred and uncertain. Parnell hissed, "Don't answer." The voice called again, closer. A flare burst overhead, bathing the field in pale green light. Silhouettes appeared. 3, maybe 4 soldiers moving low. Bishop's finger tightened on the trigger. He fired first. The flare died, plunging everything back into blackness. Screams followed, then silence. He sat there afterward, chest heaving. The world seemed to tilt. He realized his hands were shaking violently. Parnell reached over, steadying him. "You did what you had to," he said quietly. Bishop nodded but said nothing. They stayed awake till dawn, afraid of what dreams might bring. Rommel returns. Hundreds of miles away, in a car, racing through the German countryside, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel finally received confirmation that the invasion was real. He had left for Germany 2 days earlier to see his wife. Now, as reports poured in, thousands of ships, airborne landings, entire divisions ashore, he knew the nightmare he had predicted had arrived. He barked into his field telephone. "Tell 7th Army to counterattack at once. Move the panzers, all of them." The officer on the other end hesitated. "Mein Feldmarschall, we cannot. Hitler has not authorized release." Rommel's hand trembled on the receiver. "Then we've already lost." He slammed the phone down. The decision to hold back the armored divisions would doom the German defense. By the time they moved, the Allies would be too strong to dislodge. The dawn patrol. When morning came again, June 7th, the world looked utterly changed. Smoke drifted over the fields. The thunder of artillery rolled endlessly. Columns of American troops now moved inland from Utah and Omaha, linking up with the airborne units. The paratroopers, filthy and hollow-eyed, blinked at the sight of fresh soldiers and intact equipment, as if seeing ghosts themselves. A tank crewman leaned from his Sherman, grinning. "You the 101st? Was last time I checked," Parnell replied. The man tossed them a can of rations. "Breakfast on Uncle Sam." Bishop caught it, smiling faintly. "You ever sleep through a war?" "Not this one," the tankman said and rolled on. For the first time since the jump, Bishop allowed himself to sit back and watch the sunlight creep across the hedgerows. The nightmare night was over. But in every direction, he could hear the rumble of distant guns. Normandy was far from won. The paratroopers had done their part. But they had also learned something deeper. War was no longer about perfect plans. It was about men scattered and scared, holding fast in the dark, until the dawn found them still alive. And in that they had succeeded. June 8, 1944. The third dawn over Normandy broke under low clouds and the smell of wet gunpowder. The beaches were secure, the link between Utah and Omaha still tenuous, and the fate of the entire Allied front rested on a single small town, Carentan. The Germans held it like a clenched fist, guarding the only land bridge between the 2 American beachheads. If Carentan stayed in enemy hands, the 1st and 4th Infantry Divisions would remain isolated, and the Allies would fight 2 separate wars in Normandy. The task of taking it fell to the paratroopers' men already battered, scattered, and half-starved after 3 days of constant combat. The order from General Maxwell Taylor was simple, brutal, and clear: take Carentan, no matter what it costs. German machine guns overlooked every approach, zeroed in with deadly precision. The paratroopers of the 502nd PIR, led by Colonel Robert Cole, would have to cross it head-on. At 0400 on June 10th, Cole's battalion moved out under cover of artillery fire. Rain misted down, turning the causeway into slick mud. The paratroopers advanced in single-file rifles held high above the floodwater. The Germans opened up almost immediately, MG-42s from the hedgerows ahead, ripping the morning apart. Men dropped into the ditches, water splashing crimson. Cole shouted, "Forward! Keep moving," his voice barely carried over the gunfire. He ran along the line, striking helmets with his carbine to drive his men onward. The air was alive with ricochets. One soldier screamed as a bullet tore through his shoulder. Another slipped into the water and vanished. The column stalled, pinned by fire from a farmhouse at the far end of the causeway. Cole called for artillery, but radio contact was spotty. "Where's that smoke?" he bellowed. At last, shells whistled overhead and exploded beyond the hedgerow, throwing up plumes of earth and smoke. It wasn't enough. The Germans kept firing. Cole made his decision. He stood up in full view of the enemy and yelled, "Fix bayonets!" 200 paratroopers, soaked, filthy, and furious, snapped bayonets onto their rifles. Cole raised his carbine, took a breath, and shouted, "Follow me!" They surged forward in a roar, sprinting across open ground toward the German positions. The hedgerows erupted in fire tracers flashing inches above their heads. Men fell every few yards, but the line never broke. Cole himself reached the enemy trench first, leaping inside and firing point blank. His men poured in behind him, stabbing, shooting, screaming. The Germans broke. Those who could ran. Those who couldn't surrendered. When the shooting stopped, the air stank of smoke, mud, and blood. Cole slumped against the wall of the farmhouse, chest heaving. His helmet was dented, his face streaked with grime. "Secure that road," he ordered hoarsely. "We're not done yet." The attack became Legend Cole's Charge, one of the last successful bayonet assaults in American history. Inside Carentan, 2 days later, June 12th, the 101st Airborne entered the outskirts of Carentan. The town was a tangle of narrow streets, stone houses, and German strongpoints. Snipers fired from attic windows. Machine guns swept the open squares. Every corner was a death trap. Lieutenant Dick Winters led his men through the southern district. The streets were slick with rain and debris. He moved cautiously, carbine-raised eyes darting between doorways. A German MG opened up from the upper floor of a cafe, shredding plaster and brick. "Flank it," Winters shouted. His men dashed through an alley, bursting into the building from behind. The fight was over in seconds, close, brutal, personal. They cleared house after house, room by room, grenade by grenade. Civilians cowered in cellars as the thunder rolled above. A woman whispered "Les Américains" and wept when they nodded. By noon, the 101st had reached the town square. Cole's men pushed in from the east. The German defense crumbled. At 1400 hours, the Stars and Stripes rose over the Carentan church tower. It had cost hundreds of lives, but the road between Utah and Omaha was now open. The Allied beachheads were finally linked. The counterattack, the victory barely had time to breathe. At dawn on June 13th, the counterattack came the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, fresh from reserve, supported by tanks and artillery. The first shells hit at 0630. The ground trembled as the German armor advanced down the road, from Perrier engines growling like beasts. Paratroopers scrambled to their positions along the hedgerows outside town. "Here they come," someone shouted. Shermans from the 2nd Armored Division, newly arrived from the beaches, moved up alongside them. The clash that followed was pure chaos, smoke, mud, fire. Bishop crouched in a ditch beside one of the tanks, his face blackened with powder. The tank's gun fired point blank, obliterating a German half-track. He felt the concussion in his bones. A voice crackled over the radio. "Hold your ground. Armor's on its way." The battle raged for 2 hours. At one point, German troops breached the American left flank, only to be met by a countercharge from the 506th. Bayonets flashed in the smoke. By mid-morning, the panzers began to pull back. Carentan held bloodied but unbroken. After the storm, when the guns finally fell silent, the survivors moved through the wreckage in stunned quiet. The town was in ruins. The air stank of smoke and cordite. Broken shutters clattered in the wind. Medics moved among the wounded, tagging bodies with strips of cloth. Bishop sat on the steps of a ruined bakery, staring at his mud-caked boots. Parnell dropped beside him, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. "That it?" Bishop asked. "For now," Parnell said, "until they send us somewhere worse." They sat in silence, watching a column of Sherman tanks rumble past toward the west. Behind them, a French boy, no more than 10, crept from a doorway, clutching an apple. He offered it to Bishop with a shy smile. Bishop took it, nodding. "Merci, kid." The boy pointed toward the horizon where smoke still rose and whispered, "Finn." Bishop looked out across the fields of Normandy, the hedgerows still crawling with movement, the distant thunder of guns that promised more battles to come. Nani said quietly, "Pas encore." Not yet. The airborne had survived the night-taken Carentan and held the line. But ahead lay the long grind through France, every field, every village, every mile bought in blood. The war was only beginning. June 14, 1944. Normandy had become a battlefield, without edges, a sprawl of fields, hedgerows, and ruined hamlets, where every tree concealed an ambush, and every road could lead to death. The Germans called it Heckengebiet, hedgerow country. The Americans had other names: the Green Hell, the Maze, the Butcher's Garden. For the men of the 101st Airborne, Carentan was behind them, but safety was an illusion. Orders came down that morning from General Taylor: push south and west, secure the approaches to Saint-Côme-du-Mont, and hold the Douve River line. The Germans were regrouping. Intelligence spoke of counterattacks from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division and remnants of Fallschirmjäger, Regiment 6. Paratrooper Jack Bishop woke stiff and sore on the floor of a half-collapsed farmhouse. His uniform reeked of sweat and mud. His canteen was half empty. The town around them was quiet now, too quiet. The civilians who had cheered the day before were gone, their doors bolted shut again. "Up and moving," Sergeant Parnell ordered. "They'll hit back soon, and I don't want to be here when they do." Bishop grabbed his carbine and followed the squad into the pale dawn. The roads were lined with the wrecks of war, shattered bicycles, dead horses burned out half-tracks. The air buzzed with flies. Through the bocage, the men moved along a narrow lane hemmed in by high earth embankments overgrown with ivy and brambles. The hedgerows rose 8 feet tall, turning every field into a fortress. The Germans had adapted quickly, digging firing positions into the corners, camouflaging machine guns with vines, laying mines in the ditches. At every bend, they expected contact. It came just after 0900. A single rifle shot cracked from ahead, and the point man dropped without a sound. The squad dove for cover bullets, tearing through the leaves above. "Contact front," Parnell shouted. "Flank them." Bishop crawled into a drainage ditch, water up to his elbows. The Germans were hidden beyond the next hedge, their MG-42 cutting the lane in half. He spotted a gap in the brush, a momentary flash of movement. He fired twice, then threw a grenade overhand. The explosion shook the ground. Toye charged through the smoke, Thompson spitting fire. The hedge erupted with shouts and screams. Moments later, it was quiet again, except for the ringing in their ears. Parnell stood scanning the smoke-filled gap. "You all right, Bishop?" Bishop nodded, though his hands trembled. "I think so." "Then keep moving," the sergeant said. "We got a country to liberate." They advanced another 2 miles that morning, taking one field after another. Every step was bought with blood. The Battle of the Hedgerows. By mid-June, the fighting across Normandy had settled into a brutal rhythm. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. The Allies held the beaches and Carentan, but every attempt to break out met the same wall of green. German infantry, well dug in and familiar with the terrain, used the bocage as natural fortifications. Tanks were useless in the narrow lanes, their guns unable to traverse. American armor had to smash through hedgerows by brute force, exposing itself to Panzerfausts waiting in the next field. Paratroopers and infantry fought side by side, crawling through ditches, throwing grenades over the hedges, and storming through the gaps as though storming castles. The air was thick with dust gun smoke and the sickly sweet smell of decay. At night, the glow of artillery flickered constantly on the horizon. In his field notes, Colonel Robert Sink, commander of the 506th PIR, wrote, "The terrain here consumes men. The enemy is invisible until he's 10 yards away. We fight by instinct, not by sight." German paratroopers held it fiercely, their MG nests interlocked across every street. The 502nd hit the town from the north, while the 506th moved in from the east. The fight began before dawn. Mortar shells rained down as the Americans advanced, their boots sliding in the mud. Buildings caught fire, filling the air with black smoke. Inside one burning barn, Bishop found a wounded German lying amid straw and debris. The man, barely 20, looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes. He reached into his tunic. Bishop raised his carbine, but instead of a weapon, the soldier produced a photograph of a young woman and a baby. Bishop hesitated, lowering his gun. "Get him to the medics," he said. Toya stared. "You sure about that?" Bishop nodded. "War's big enough for ghosts. Don't make more." They dragged the German outside just as the barn collapsed behind them. By noon, Sainte-Combe was theirs. The German line along the Douve had collapsed, and the remnants were retreating south toward Perrier. The paratroopers had done it again, but the victory felt hollow. They had entered Normandy 13,000 strong. Less than half were still combat effective. The German withdrawal at 7th Army headquarters in Saint-Lô, the tone of the German reports had shifted from disbelief to despair. Communications were collapsing under Allied air attacks. Convoys were shredded by P-47 Thunderbolts and the roads choked with wreckage. Field Marshal Rommel surveyed the situation maps, his face drawn. "If we don't counterattack soon," he said to General Dolman, "we will be driven into the Seine." Dolman spread his hands. "With what, mein Feldmarschall? The panzers have no fuel. The infantry have no reserves." Rommel stared for a long moment, then said softly, "Then we are fighting ghosts, and the ghosts are winning." The men of the 101st huddled beneath ponchos in the ruins of a barn, listening to the steady drum of drops on the tin roof. Parnell passed around a can of cold rations, beans mostly, and a piece of stale bread. "Dinner à la Normandy," he said. Bishop managed a weak laugh. His body ached. His boots were torn, and his uniform smelled like rot. But for the first time since June 6th, he allowed himself to believe they might live to see another day. Outside, thunder rolled across the horizon, not weather, but artillery. The front never slept. Parnell looked at him. "You ever think about home?" "Sometimes," Bishop said. "Mostly I just think about tomorrow." "Yeah," Parnell murmured. "Tomorrow's a long way off." The rain continued drumming like the heartbeat of a living, wounded land. The men who had fallen from the midnight sky were still fighting not just for ground, but for survival inch by inch, field by field, through the living walls of Normandy's green hell. They had held Carentan, cracked Sainte-Combe, and opened the way inland. But the breakout, the push beyond the bocage, still lay ahead, and for that every lesson of the airborne would be tested again. June 20th, 1944. Normandy bled and burned beneath a sky of steel. The land that had once been quiet farmland was now a maze of trenches, foxholes, and shattered villages. For the men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, the mission had shifted from lightning strike to endurance test. They were no longer falling from the sky, they were rooted in the mud, tasked with holding what they had bought at such terrible cost. The bocage still ruled the battlefield. Hedgerows that looked innocent from above had become killing walls. The Americans called them green concrete. You could hear the enemy 10 feet away and never see him. The Germans dug machine gun pits into the corners of every field and linked them by tunnels and drains. They could vanish like ghosts and reappear behind you. By late June, the 101st Airborne was positioned along the approaches to Saint-Lô, the hub of Normandy's road network. To take Saint-Lô was to open the gate to the French interior, to Paris itself. But every inch of ground toward that city was guarded by men who had sworn to die where they stood. The waiting, the days blurred into one another. Rain fell almost constantly, turning the foxholes into pools of brown water. The smell of decay, of mud, sweat, cordite, and the sweet rot of death hung over everything. Private Jack Bishop sat in a hole he'd dug himself, a poncho draped over his helmet. He had stopped counting the days since the jump. His hands were perpetually dirty, his fingernails black with grime. He'd learned to eat, sleep, and fight without thinking. Sergeant Parnell crouched beside him, peering through binoculars toward a distant copse of trees. "They've got mortars in that grove," he muttered. "See the flashes?" Bishop nodded. The shells came seconds later, whistling overhead and thudding into the fields behind them. Dirt and leaves rained down. "Guess they see us too," Parnell said dryly. They hunkered down, waiting for the next salvo. Overhead, P-47 Thunderbolts droned low, dropping bombs beyond the next ridge. The shock waves rippled through the ground like the heartbeat of a giant. By afternoon, the rain stopped and steam rose from the wet fields. The silence that followed was worse than the shelling. "Hell of a place to spend the summer," Parnell said. Bishop just stared at the horizon where smoke rose from St. Lo like a funeral pyre. The counterattacks the Germans struck that night, emerging from the mist with grenades and burp guns. They hit the American flank hard, using the hedgerows as cover. Tracers sliced through the dark. "Get on that gun!" Parnell shouted, dragging Bishop toward a captured MG-42 mounted on a tripod. Bishop squeezed the trigger, and the gun roared, spitting flame and brass. He swept the hedgerow, cutting down the first wave. Reloading, Parnell hurled grenades into the shadows. The explosions flashed, revealing silhouettes stumbling and falling. One German crawled forward, shouting in panic, before a burst of fire silenced him. It lasted 10 minutes, then 20, then stopped as suddenly as it began. The fields went quiet again. Only the wounded cried out. "Medic," someone yelled, voice cracking. The Americans counted their dead. 12 men gone, more wounded. The bodies lay where they'd fallen, half hidden in grass. Parnell sat down heavily beside Bishop, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "They keep testing us," he said, "looking for weak spots." Bishop nodded. "So far they haven't found one." Parnell exhaled smoke. "Yeah, let's hope we don't either." His face was drawn, his uniform streaked with dust. Every village was a ruin, every road cratered, every field a grave. He stopped near St. Lo, stepping out to inspect a destroyed Panzer IV. The smell of burned rubber and flesh filled the air. His aide, Major Helmuth Lang, approached hesitantly. "Mein Feldmarschall," he said, "we are losing ground everywhere. The Americans attack by air before every advance. We cannot move by day." Rommel nodded grimly. "They control the skies. That is half the battle." He looked toward the distant horizon where the steady drone of Allied aircraft filled the air. "We are fighting giants." A courier handed him a dispatch, reports of Allied buildups near St. Lo, fresh divisions, more armor, endless artillery. Rommel read it, folded it, and said softly, "This is no longer about victory. It is about time." He knew what few in Berlin dared to admit: Normandy was lost. It was only a matter of how long the Reich could bleed before it broke. The living and the dead. The following day, a thick fog rolled in from the coast, muffling sound and vision alike. The world seemed to shrink to 50 yards in every direction. The men called it ghost weather. In that haze, both sides moved like phantoms. Patrols stumbled upon each other without warning, fights breaking out at knife range. A man could die without ever seeing who killed him. Near a ruined orchard south of Carentan, Bishop's squad ran headlong into a German patrol. The first shots came at 10 feet. A grenade exploded between them, flinging dirt and shrapnel. Bishop's ears rang. He saw a German soldier rising from the smoke rifle leveled. Before the shot came, Parnell fired, dropping him. When it was over, 5 Germans lay dead. 2 Americans as well. The fog swallowed them all. They buried their fallen behind the hedgerow. Parnell placed a helmet on one mound and whispered, "We'll take the next field for you boys." Bishop said nothing. His throat was too tight to speak. The price of momentum. By the end of June, St. Lo was encircled. The 29th Infantry Division pressed from the north, the 2nd Armored from the west, and the paratroopers held the southern approaches. The Germans, trapped inside the shattered city, fought with ferocity born of desperation. Every street became a fortress, every cellar a firing position. Artillery pounded the town until it was nothing but dust and echoes. When the Americans finally entered on July 18th, after weeks of grinding combat, they found no intact buildings, only rubble and bodies. A reporter from Stars and Stripes wrote, "Saint-Lô is not a city. It is a wound." Bishop and Parnell walked through what was left of a main square. The cobblestones were buried under ash. A single wall still stood its sign reading Boulangerie. Parnell looked around. "We fought for this," Bishop nodded slowly. "Yeah, because if we didn't, they'd still be here." He looked up at the gray sky, where just weeks earlier they had fallen through the dark into the unknown. "We started in the clouds," he murmured. "Now we're in the dirt, but we're still moving." Parnell clapped his shoulder. "Then keep moving, Jack. That's what wins wars." They turned toward the west, where the roads now led inland toward Avranches, toward Paris, toward the end of the nightmare. The airborne had done the impossible, dropped blind into darkness, held against all odds, and broken the first chain of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. But the price had been beyond measure. In Normandy's fields, among the hedgerows and the rain, the ghosts of those who had fallen from the midnight sky still kept their silent watch, guarding the path that led from the beaches to freedom. July 25th, 1944. The roar of Operation Cobra thundered across Normandy. The American First Army unleashed a carpet of bombs west of Saint-Lô, shattering the German front line in a single cataclysmic wave. What began as a whispering rumor among foxholes, Patton's coming, became the reality of a breakout. But for the men of the airborne divisions, the fight had already turned into something quieter, heavier, endurance, reflection, and reckoning. Private Jack Bishop sat in the back of a muddy GMC truck rattling south toward Perrier. His uniform hung in tatters. His carbine lay across his knees. Around him sat the remnants of his squad, half the men who had jumped into Normandy 7 weeks before. The rest were gone, their names etched already into memory. Sergeant Parnell chewed on a cigar butt, staring out the tailgate at the passing hedgerows. "You ever think," he said slowly, "that we ain't fighting for ground anymore, just to keep each other breathing?" Bishop looked at him, then out at the ruined countryside. The blackened trees, the cratered fields, the shattered churches. "That's enough," he said softly. "That's the only fight that matters now." What had been soft farmland now looked like the surface of another planet. Whole orchards were flattened by shellfire. Villages like Saint-Lô-Carentan and Saint-Côme-du-Mont were nothing but hollow shells. The sweet smell of clover and apples had given way to cordite diesel and the ever-present odor of death. The French civilians, those who had survived, emerged cautiously from the ruins. Old men wept openly when they saw the paratroopers' eagle patches. Children followed the columns of trucks, shouting "Vive les Américains" and holding out flowers. In one village, a woman pressed a loaf of bread into Bishop's hands. "For liberty," she said in broken English. He tore it in half and gave her a piece back. "For both of us," he replied. After the breakout, as the main armies poured through the gap at Saint-Lô, the airborne troops were pulled back to reorganize. For the first time since June 6th, they could breathe, but the silence of rest was foreign, almost frightening. In the orchards outside Carentan, they set up tents and field kitchens. Showers were rigged from steel drums and hoses. The smell of soap replaced the smell of gunpowder, if only for a day. Bishop sat cleaning his rifle under the dappled light of an apple tree. His hands moved automatically. He had done it so many times, the motions were mechanical, even comforting. Across from him, Parnell flipped through a crumpled letter from home, the paper creased and stained. "My sister says the papers back home call us heroes," he said. "Says folks in town hang flags for the 101st. Bishop kept working. "Heroes don't stink this bad." Parnell smiled faintly. "Guess that's true." He looked around at the campmen sleeping, smoking, writing letters. "You think people will remember this?" What it took, Bishop paused. "They'll remember D-Day, the beaches, the flags, and us." He shook his head slowly. "Maybe not by name, but they'll walk free because of us. That's enough." The failed counterattacks in Normandy had bled the Wehrmacht white. Entire divisions had ceased to exist. In July alone, over 200,000 men were lost, killed, captured, or missing. Field Marshal Rommel knew the end was near. On July 17th, while traveling between headquarters, his staff car was strafed by an Allied fighter. The windshield shattered. Shrapnel tore through his face and skull. He survived barely, but his war was over. In Berlin, Hitler raged, issuing impossible orders to stand fast in France. His generals, hollow-eyed and broken, obeyed out of habit more than faith. The Atlantic Wall, once touted as impregnable, had crumbled in 40 days. And it had begun not with tanks or battleships, but with men who fell through the dark, armed only with rifles and courage. A letter home. That night, under a sky strangely clear after weeks of smoke, Bishop sat by a flickering lantern and wrote a letter he knew he might never send. Dear Ma, it's quiet tonight. Too quiet, maybe. The frogs are back in the ditches, and the smell of apples is starting to come back after the rain. You wouldn't know this place for a battlefield now, except for the crosses. There are a lot of them. We've been here since the jump. It feels like a lifetime. Sometimes I think about that first night, the wind, the dark, the tracer fire. I remember the plane shaking and the green light coming on. I remember thinking that if I lived through it, I'd never complain about anything again. We made it. Most of us. Enough of us. When people ask what it was like, I'll tell them it was loud and wet and terrifying. But mostly, it was just men trying to do right by each other. That's all it ever was. Love, Jack. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his pack. Ghosts of the morning. A few days later, the airborne divisions were relieved and pulled back toward Cherbourg for refitting. Trucks lined the roads. New recruits climbed aboard as veterans climbed off limping and silent. Before boarding, Bishop turned to look back one last time at the fields of Normandy. The hedgerows glinting in the afternoon sun, the distant hum of bombers still crossing overhead. Hard to believe we fell out of the sky over that, Parnell said beside him. Bishop nodded. Hard to believe we lived through it. They climbed into the truck. The engine coughed to life, rattling down the rutted lane toward the coast. Dust rose behind them, drifting like smoke through the trees. The legacy, in the months that followed, the story of the airborne spread through every corner of the Allied world. Newspapers called them the men who fell before dawn. Film reels showed grainy footage of their jump, their faces hard and determined beneath their helmets. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, in his address from liberated France, said simply, "No words can do justice to those who came first. The night belonged to them, and because of them, the morning belonged to us." The paratroopers became legend, not for victory alone, but for endurance, for the sheer defiance of their existence. They had jumped into darkness and reshaped history with their bare hands. The eternal night. Years later, when the fields of Normandy had grown green again, and the hedgerows were silent, the wind still carried faint echoes, the rumble of engines, the flap of parachutes, the distant call of flash. Thunder. In Sainte-Mère-Église, the church steeple still bore the mannequin of John's steel parachute, tangled in its spire. Tourists would look up and wonder how any man could survive such a fall. But those who had been there, the few who still lived, knew the truth that the fall was not the miracle. The miracle was what came after. They had dropped as strangers, scattered and afraid, into the heart of the enemy. They rose as one, and by the time the sun rose on June 6, 1944, the German army and perhaps the world would never be the same again.